Welcome to F214, the nerves module, or the nerves unit. There are three different screencasts which cover nerves. The first one deals with the idea of sensory receptors, and also then goes on to look at the structure of two different types of nerve cell. So dealing with sensory receptors first of all, the idea of a sensory receptor, you remember at GCSE you talked about the senses, and indeed you looked at the structure of the eye in considerable detail. And the interest we have here at A-level is really the cells which are able to sense some form of stimulus in the environment. Okay, so what we do is that we are able to respond, we're able to detect various types of energy in our environment. And the idea of a sensory receptor is that it is able to convert some form of energy in the environment into another type of energy. And in this case, it transfers it into an electrical impulse, which can then be sent along a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Okay, so the general principle is that a sensory receptor is an energy transducer. That is, that it converts one type of energy into another. In this case, the other type of energy is an electrical impulse. Okay, but as we'll see, we're able to convert various types of energy into electrical impulses. Okay, so as I've said here, they change one form of energy into electrical energy in the form of a nerve impulse. Okay, now to try and explain how that happens, if I look down here, sensory receptors are examples of what we call excitable cells. Okay, as we'll discover later on in this unit, nerve cells are also an example of an excitable cell. And an excitable cell is a cell which has, if you imagine this being a cell, this round circle representing a cell with its cell surface membrane here, excitable cells have an uneven distribution of ions, charged ions, across its membrane. And what we usually find is that there is more positively charged ions outside the cell than there are inside the cell. Okay, and particularly so for the sodium ion. As you remember, sodium ions are positively charged ions, and what the cell does is it pumps these ions out of the cell, so there's more of them outside the cell than there is inside the cell. Okay, and because the cell is therefore slightly negatively charged inside, the negative charge attracts these positively charged sodium ions to the outer surface of the cell. Okay, so what we've got is a slightly negatively charged cell inside with respect to outside. And what happens with these excitable cells is that there will be some form of stimulus, energy from the environment, which will cause a change in the permeability of the cell membrane to these sodium ions. Okay, so what happens is there's some form of external energy which then suddenly causes these sodium ions to leak into the cell. So what happens is that there is some energy which results in these sodium ions suddenly moving into the cell. Okay, that causes a wave of depolarization, so all these sodium ions suddenly start moving into the cell. Okay, and that causes some form of chemical signaling to occur. So a neurotransmitter is released in response to this these sodium ions moving into the cell, which is then transmitted to another sensory nerve fibre, which then sends an electrical impulse along its length, and we'll look to see how that is achieved later on. Okay, so in terms of what we got here is a sensory receptor is an excitable cell which responds to some form of energy in the environment, which is a stimulus, which causes a change in the permeability of the cell membranes to sodium ions, which causes an electrical impulse to be generated around the outside of the cell membrane, which then results in a chemical being released as a cell signaler. Okay, so that's how they work. Going back to the details of how the various different types do work, we've got different cells here. We've got our rod and cone cells, which you learnt a little bit about at GCSE. We've got these cells in the cochlea of the ear, which detect vibrations in the air. We've got olfactory organ cells, which detect chemical signals in the air. We've got taste buds, which have cells which detect particular chemicals in the food that we eat. And then we've got various types of cell which can detect touch. Okay, and to see how each of these work very briefly, I don't think you really have to know much about the detail of each of these, but just to show you how they all work. If I look at this here, here's a rod cell. Okay, so a rod cell, it's got these membranes which are full of a pigment. Okay, a pigment, and what happens is that when light falls on this pigment, it changes conformation. Okay, it changes, a little photochemical reaction occurs which changes the shape of this pigment. That sets off a train of biochemical processes within the cell, and those biochemicals that are produced diffuse to the cell surface membrane, okay, where they cause a change in the permeability of the cell membrane to these charged ions. Okay, so the ions then diffuse in along concentration gradients, which causes a depolarization of the cell surface membrane, a change of the polarity, and that change is then signaled around the cell surface of these membranes. This signal gets passed around the cell surface of these membranes, gets to the end here, and a neurotransmitter is released from here to a sensory neuron, which then takes that message to the central nervous system. Okay, so that's how a rod cell works. Okay, so light energy is being converted into an electrical signal, which is then passed around the cell, which then causes a chemical signaling substance, a neurotransmitter, to be released, which then causes an electrical impulse to be passed along a sensory neuron. Here we have cells in the cochlea of the ear. Okay, this is a cell here which has these hair-like structures which are attached to it, and what happens is that they vibrate. Okay, when sound waves get passed through the cochlea of the ear. I'm not going to go into the detail of the structure of the ear here because it's not important, but these cells, they vibrate when particular wavelengths of sound, particularly frequencies of sound and amplitudes of sound. What happens is that they move, and the movement disrupts proteins in their cell surface membrane, which in this case allows potassium ions to diffuse into the cell, which causes a change in the electrical distribution of ions across its cell surface, and that then is passed through the cell surface membrane around here, and again a neurotransmitter is released, okay, and that causes a signal to be set up in the sensory neuron, which takes that information to the brain. Okay, last example here is a touch receptor, and the touch receptor here is slightly different in what this particular example is a thing called a Pacinian corpuscle. Again, you don't have to know the name of that. Okay, but what it is, it's a cell, okay, which has layers and layers of fatty tissue, and what happens is that embedded into that fatty corpuscle is a nerve ending of a sensory neuron here. Okay, and it's a sensory neuron here, which is the excitable cell, in that it has the uneven distribution of these sodium ions around the outside of the cell membrane. What the actual corpuscle does is, whenever it's deformed, when you touch something, what happens is a deformation of your skin, which alters the shape of all these fatty layers, and that energy is transmitted through the fatty layers as they're deformed, which causes what we call stretch-mediated sodium ion channels to open. Okay, so it disrupts the membrane, such as these channels that allow sodium ions into the cell suddenly open. Sodium ions come in, and then that signal is then transmitted along the sensory neuron to the brain. Okay, so the details of how all these receptors work is not really important here. The important thing is to understand that all of them work as energy transducers, which are able to convert some form of energy stimulus in the environment into an electrical energy in the form of a nerve impulse. Okay, and again, this word energy transducer is a word you should be aware of. Okay, and then some of the details. Membranes of receptors are polarized, i.e. they've got more sodium ions outside than in. This is due to an active transport pump, okay, which creates what we call a resting potential. That resting potential being the fact that it's more positively charged outside with respect to inside. And we'll find out more about resting potentials when we look at nerve cells later on. Okay, the energy, external energy, the stimulus, okay, causes the receptor cells to change their permeability to these ions. Okay, and that causes something which is called a generator potential in sensory cells. And if the generator potential is large enough, then something called an action potential occurs, and the action potential is then propagated around the cell and then results in a nerve impulse being propagated along a sensory neuron. Okay, and then light is a photochemical reaction, okay, which produces a secondary messenger in the cell which opens ion channels. And touch deformation of membranes opens stretch-mediated ion channels, and smell and taste chemical binds to receptor, which leads to ion channel opening. Okay, so that's how all these sensory receptors actually work. Now, if I move on to the next slide, this slide deals with the structure of various two types of neuron, a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. If you cast your mind back to when you did GCSE, you'll remember studying a reflex, okay? And you were probably shown a diagram which looked a bit like this. This is a cross-section of the spinal cord, and this is showing how information is passed through the nervous system, taking information from some form of receptor, sensory receptor, through here to some sort of reflex. Okay, so this could be you removing your hand very quickly, having touched a hot plate, or it could be the doctor tapping your kneecap with a hammer and you having a reflex kick, whatever it is. Okay, so the system works like this. You have information comes into the central nervous system through something called a sensory neuron, okay, which takes information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Okay, inside the central nervous system we have things called relay neurons, or it's called an interneuron here. Okay, but we probably call them relay neurons, and then the relay neuron links with a thing called a motor neuron, which takes the information from the central nervous system out to the effector, which in this case is a muscle. Okay, and the muscle then contracts and pulls your hand away from the hot plate or whatever. Okay, so you remember that. So what we're going to look at is the structure of these sensory neurons, which take information from sensory receptors to the CNS, and compare those with the structure of motor neurons, which take information from the central nervous system and take that to a muscle or effector organ of some sort. Okay, so dealing with the sensory neuron first of all, here we have our sensory cells here. So these could be our photoreceptor cells in the retina of the eye, rod cells. It could be our Pacinian corpuscle. It could be our those hair cells in the cochlea we talked about in the last slide. Whatever. Okay, so they link to release of some form of transmitter, which then passes information on to the sensory neuron. Okay, and the structures are the sensory neuron has branches which connect with these sensory cells, which are called dendrites. That information then all gets passed into one long structure, which is called a dendron. Okay, and that dendron then passes along past the cell body, and then passes information onto the axon, okay, which then takes the information into the central nervous system, where it connects with relay neurons. okay, via things called synapses, which I remember still talking about at GCSE, which we'll study in a little bit more detail later on. Okay, so this is a cell, much in the same way as any cell. So it's got a cell body. Okay, the cell body here contains the nucleus with its DNA, and will have all sorts of organelles, ribosomes, and endoplasmic reticulum, and rough endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, and all these things occur in the cell body. Okay, now in a sensory neuron, the cell body sits on a side arm. Okay, and these side arms are usually fairly close to the central nervous system. Okay, in fact they collect in things called ganglia, which lie just outside the spinal cord. Okay, so you might have talked about dorsal root ganglions when you did GCSE. Okay, that's where the cell bodies collect all these sensory neurons, which are then taking information into the central nervous system. Okay, so looking back down here, we have, trying to orientate that, we've got our dendrites here, okay, which all feed into a dendron here, and the dendron then goes up until it reaches this bit here, which is the cell body. Okay, and the information then goes passed straight onto the thing called the axon, and the axon is quite short and takes information into the central nervous system. Okay, so a long dendron, short axon with its cell body on this side arm. Okay, now the reason the cell body is on the side arm is that all these organelles that the cell needs to survive, okay, would, if they were in these very tiny narrow fibres here, they would interfere with the transmission of these electrical impulses. Okay, so all the information, all the the organelles of the cell are on this side arm here. Okay, so that's why it is structured as it is. Okay, so that's the structure of a sensory neuron. So just going back to my... So the sensory neuron takes information from the periphery somewhere, it could be the retina, it could be the skin, some form of sensoreceptor, and takes that information to the central nervous system. Okay, it's got dendrites here, these branches here, which feed information into this long structure called a dendron. Okay, and then the dendron leads to the axon, and then just where the dendron leads to the axon, we have this side arm which contains the cell body. Okay, and this cell body sits just outside the central nervous system. Okay, so long dendron, short axon. Okay, and it says dendrites attached to dendron. Dendrites here, dendron there. Okay, so that's the structure of the sensory neuron. Moving on to look at the structure of the motor neuron. Here we've got a diagram of a motor neuron here, and the motor neuron takes information from the central nervous system. So this is the cell body of the motor neuron, which is actually in the central nervous system. Okay, so here the dendrites connect directly to the cell body. Okay, so there's no appreciable structure called a dendron here. Okay, the dendrites are connected directly to the cell body. Okay, so information comes in here, converges from all sorts of other relay neurons which take information in here. Okay, you've then got an area called the axon hillock, which feeds into a thing called the axon. Okay, and the axon hillock is the region, if you like, which adds up and subtracts all the information that comes in to the cell body and decides whether or not an impulse is going to be sent along the axon. Okay, and we'll come back to that process later on. Okay, so we then have this structure called the axon, okay, which can be very long, which takes information from our cell body, which is in the central nervous system, where it then links to some form of effector organ. So this could be something called a neuromuscular junction, which connects this to a muscle. Okay, that's what we call the axon terminal. And we have these synapses here, which will link with whatever this neuron is linking with. Okay, you'll notice that the axon is surrounded by these blobs here, which are actually cells called Schwann cells. You can see that word Schwann cell in there. And a Schwann cell is a structure, and here's a Schwann cell here. So if you can imagine this being a cross-section of our axon, a cross-section of that bit there, looking at it on end on. And a Schwann cell is essentially a cell which is wrapped round and round and round the axon, okay, with its cell body here on the outside squished to the end. Again, it's wrapped round, and the cell membrane has a fatty material in it called myelin, which creates this layer of this fatty insulating material, okay, and that has a number of advantages. What it allows is for the electrical activity in this cell to be insulated from the electrical activity in any neighbouring cell, okay, but it also, as we'll see later, it speeds up the process of these electrical impulses moving along the axon, and the details of that I'll explain in another slide. Okay, so in summary, looking at the structure of a motor neuron, okay, so it takes information from the central nervous system, so the cell body here is embedded in the central nervous system, okay, as we showed it in this diagram down here. So here is the cell body which is embedded in the central nervous system there, and then the axon stretches out and connects with some form of effector organ or muscle somewhere around the body, okay, and it's got short dendrils, well, it doesn't have dendrils at all, it's got dendrites which connect directly to the cell body, okay, it's got a long axon, okay, and the axon has myelin containing Schwann cell wrapped around it, okay, and those Schwann cells are separated by little gaps which are called nodes of Ranvier, and we'll look at the significance of those nodes of Ranvier later on. Okay, so looking at this, the diagram here shows our Schwann cell here separated by a little gap called the node of Ranvier, which here, and here. Okay, so those are nodes of Ranvier. So these terms here, which are all in bold, well actually they're not in bold, sorry, but these terms here are important. Okay, so dendrite, axon, cell body, Schwann cell, node of Ranvier. All of these words are important to know what they are and how to label one of these diagrams and how to be able to recognise what they do. And that comes to the end of this first screencast on nerves.